Introduction. Early in the Christian era, philosophy fell asleep. These slumbers eventually produced the philosophic dream known as scholasticism, based on Aristotle and the teachings of the Church. Philosophy was rudely awakened from these medieval slumbers in the 17th century by the arrival of Descartes, with his declaration cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. An age of enlightenment had begun. Knowledge was based on reason. But Descartes woke up more than the sleeping scholars. He also woke up the British. They soon responded to Descartes' rational claim by insisting that our knowledge is not based on reason, but on experience. In their zeal, these British empiricists soon destroyed all semblance of reason, reducing philosophy to a series of ever-diminishing sensations. Philosophy was in danger of going to sleep again. Then, in the middle of the 18th century, Kant awoke from his dogmatic slumbers and produced an even greater philosophical system than the one which had put philosophy to sleep throughout the Middle Ages. It looked as if philosophy would once again soon be emulating Rip Van Winkle. Hegel reacted to this soporific situation by constructing a huge systematic four-poster bed of his own. Schopenhauer decided to try a different tack, and introduced a draught of chilly Oriental philosophy into the Kantian bed. This had the effect of waking up the young Nietzsche, who leapt into the icy blast and began proclaiming a loud philosophy that was to keep everyone awake for a long time to come. Nietzsche's life and works. With Nietzsche, philosophy becomes dangerous again, this time with a difference. In previous centuries, philosophy had been dangerous for philosophers. With Nietzsche, it becomes dangerous for everyone. Nietzsche ended up by going mad, and this begins to show in the tone of his later writings. But the dangerous ideas started appearing long before he went mad, and have nothing to do with clinical insanity. They presaged a collective madness which was to have horrific consequences in Europe during the first half of the 20th century, and which shows ominous signs of recurrence today. Nietzsche's larger philosophical ideas are barely worthy of the name, whether he's talking about supermen, eternal recurrence, the idea that we live our lives again and again throughout eternity, or the sole purpose of civilization, to produce great men, such as Goethe, Napoleon, and himself. His use of the will to power as a universal explanation is either simplistic or meaningless. Even Freud's monism is more subtle, and Schopenhauer's less specific concept is more convincing. Like any good conspiracy theory, Nietzsche's doctrine of the all-pervasive will to power contains the usual element of paranoia. But Nietzsche's actual philosophizing is as brilliant, persuasive, and incisive as any before or since. When reading him, you get the exhilarating feeling that philosophy actually matters, which is one of the reasons why he is so dangerous. And when he used the will to power purely as an analytic tool, it enabled him to discover constituent elements in human motives which few had formerly suspected. This allowed him to unmask the values to which these motives gave rise, and trace the development of these values over a broad historical canvas, illuminating the very foundations of our civilization and culture. Although Nietzsche is not entirely free from blame for the dangerous nonsense that has been spouted in his name, it must be said that most of this is a travesty of what he actually wrote. He had nothing but contempt for the proto-fascists of his era. Anti-Semitism disgusted him, and the idea of a nation of racially pure Germans becoming a master race would certainly have exercised his sense of humour to the full. Had he lived, and retained his sanity until the 1930s, when he would have been in his 80s, he would certainly not have remained silent about the grotesque events taking place in his homeland, like some German philosophers of that era who claimed to be his successors. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born October 15, 1844, in Saxony, which was by this time a province of the increasingly powerful Kingdom of Prussia. Nietzsche was descended from a long line of tradesmen, including hatters and butchers, but his grandfather and father were both Lutheran pastors. Nietzsche's father was a patriotic Prussian who held his king, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, in high esteem. When Ludwig Nietzsche's first son was born on the king's birthday, it was obvious that he had little chance of being named Otto. By an utterly meaningless coincidence, all three men were to die insane. The first to go was Ludwig, who died in 1849. He was diagnosed as having softening of the brain, and the autopsy apparently revealed that a quarter of his brain had been affected by softening. This diagnosis is no longer fashionable with the medical profession, but Nietzsche's reputable biographers are convinced that Ludwig Nietzsche's insanity was not inherited by his son. Nietzsche was now brought up in Naumburg in a house full of holy women, which included a mother, a younger sister, a maternal grandmother, and two slightly loopy maiden aunts. This appears to have affected Nietzsche's attitude toward women in later life. At the age of 13 he went to boarding school at nearby Pforta, one of the top private boarding schools in Germany. Nietzsche, very much the product of his pious, mollycoddled upbringing, became known as the Little Pastor, and carried off all the prizes. But he was so brilliant that eventually he couldn't help thinking for himself. By the age of 18 he was beginning to doubt his faith. The clear-sighted thinker couldn't help noticing the square pegs in the round holes of the world about him. Typically this thinking appears to have been done in complete isolation. Throughout his life, Nietzsche was to be influenced in his thought by very few living people, and not many dead ones either. At the age of 19, Nietzsche went to the University of Bonn to study theology and classical philology, with the aim of becoming a pastor. His destiny had been mapped out long beforehand by the holy women, but already he was beginning to experience an unconscious urge to rebellion, which resulted in a transformation of his character. On arriving at Bonn, the solitary schoolboy unexpectedly became a typical gregarious student. He joined a smart fraternity, took to drinking with his fellows, and even fought a duel, the usual artificial affair, which was stopped as soon as he had received his honourable scar, a slight nick on the nose, unfortunately later obscured by the bridge of his spectacles. But this was only a necessary phase. By now Nietzsche had decided, God is dead. This remark, now so closely associated with Nietzsche and his philosophy, was also made by Hegel some 20 years before Nietzsche was born. At home during the holidays he refused to take communion and announced that he would not be entering the church. The next year he decided to switch to Leipzig University, where he would drop theology and concentrate on classical philology. Nietzsche arrived in Leipzig in October 1865, in the same month that he celebrated his 21st birthday. Around this time, two events took place which were to transform his life. While on a sightseeing trip to Cologne, he visited a brothel. According to Nietzsche, this visit was inadvertent. On arrival, he had asked a street porter to lead him to a restaurant. Instead, the porter took him to a brothel. The way Nietzsche later related it to a friend, "All at once I found myself surrounded by half a dozen apparitions in tinsel and gauze, gazing at me expectantly. For a brief moment I was speechless. Then I made instinctively for the only soulful thing present in the place, the piano. I played a few chords, which freed me from my paralysis, and I escaped." Inevitably, we only have Nietzsche's evidence regarding this unlikely episode. Whether or not the visit was quite so accidental, and whether or not Nietzsche ended up only fondling the keys of the piano, it is impossible to tell. Nietzsche was almost certainly still a virgin at the time. He was an extremely intense young man, as well as being inexperienced and gauche in the ways of the world. Yet this didn't stop him from making pronouncements about such matters. Despite his sexual status, he earnestly informed a friend that he would need to keep 3 women to satisfy him. On later consideration, Nietzsche may have decided that he had been attracted by something more than the piano. He went back to the brothel, and almost certainly paid a few visits to similar establishments when he returned to Leipzig. Not long after this, he discovered that he was infected. The doctor who treated him wouldn't have told him that he had syphilis. They didn't. He also woke up the British. They soon responded to Descartes' rational claim by insisting that our knowledge is not based on reason, but on experience. In their zeal, these British empiricists, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. An age of enlightenment had begun. Knowledge was based on reason. But Descartes woke up more than the sleeping scholars, based on Aristotle and the teachings of the Church. Philosophy was rudely awakened from these medieval slumbers in the 17th century by the arrival of Descartes, with his declaration Cogito. Introduction. Early in the Christian era, philosophy fell asleep. These slumbers eventually produced the philosophic dream known as scholasticism, soon destroyed all semblance of reason, reducing philosophy to a series of ever-diminishing sensations. Philosophy was in danger of going to sleep again. Then, in the middle of the 18th century,